Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy.
Actually, we should do that even now, because some problems are uniquely...
Are you for freebies or are you against the freebie culture?
That's a very, very good question. Addressing the state government, and of course, the state government never listened to us. This very often, just being heard is. So the question is, how do you goes down well?
Thank you.
I must see the podcast.
Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of the Thinkin podcast here at the Kautilya School of Public Policy. Today, me and my co-anchor Nishant are delighted to have with us Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Hello and welcome here at Kautilya.
Thank you.
Let's get straight into the thick of things. So you were the architect of India's economic reforms in the 1990s, along with Dr. Manmohan Singh under the Prime Ministership of P.V. Narasimha Rao. But today we are seeing a shift towards protectionism, and there's a lot of that stuff coming from the United States itself. For emerging countries like India, how do you view this shift from liberalization to protectionism?
It is actually a very big change in the vocabulary of economic reforms globally, as you say. Now, it isn't, some people think it's driven by the fact that the earlier belief that openness, free markets, liberalization, etc., would lead to good outcomes, and the perception that perhaps it didn't lead to as good an outcome, even in the West, as was thought. And that led to some pushback. But that pushback would have led to taking some corrective steps. I mean, the United States and Europe lost productive competitiveness in many areas. So it was quite natural that developing countries would step in and their manufacturing would scale down. They should have taken appropriate steps to, as it were, reabsorb the labor rendered surplus in traditional manufacturing, and they failed to do that. But a lot of what you're seeing today is not the result of those kinds of things. I think they're the result of the United States reacting to the rise of China as an explicit challenge to their position. And the Chinese have themselves made this clear. I mean, they have said, look, we intend to challenge you technologically, militarily, and also challenge you in terms of whether you are offering, if you like, the right kind of economic system for the world. So it's a very big challenge, and they're reacting to that. And I think the rise of I don't think, by the way, that protectionism is the way to go, even for the US. But in their case, what has happened really is that in the critical technology areas where China has made a remarkable progress, and you have to give credit to them, because to achieve that progress in the world of chip making and so on is not a small thing. I think the Americans just want to prevent China from actually competing against them. They take the view that China is doing this unfairly because they've stolen technology, this, that, and the other. So what you're seeing is the US determined not to allow China to challenge them. To that, what this will do is, and Europe is following suit, whether under pressure from the US or not, I can't say, but they're having similar reactions. Now, obviously, this is going to shrink world trade, and that'll be bad for all of us. But for India, since this is driven more by an anti-China sentiment than an anti-global sentiment, it creates a possibility that although the shrinking of world trade is bad for us, and no doubt about that, the negative attitude towards China might create an opportunity that if India can come in and say, look, okay, you don't want to be that dependent on China, what about India? And I think there's a scope there for us. So from our point of view, we should try to make sure that we are in that position where people think of us as a natural alternative. Now, as my good friend Martin Wolf put it, if we really succeed in our objective and become whatever not just the third largest economy, but a close enough size to the US, it may create new tensions. But for the next 20 years, that's not likely. So I think India has an opportunity in this 20-year period.
Sir, I have a follow-up particularly on China. So you said that US and other European countries, they see China as a challenge. And I recently came across a Bloomberg report where they said that China is from being an export-driven country, now they are going ahead in research. The way the China is implementing research in the country, it's coming out with new innovations, new technologies that are actually challenging the Western world in itself. So how do we see that in the global perspective and especially protectionism also?
Well, I think what the Chinese are doing, quite frankly, is they're taking advantage of having grown the economy. I mean, you have to grow the economy in order to be able to invest in research. And the Chinese are putting probably 5 times as much into research as we are. Now, admittedly, their economy is 5 times our size. And I think whereas the Chinese government is putting money, Chinese companies are also putting money into research, and our companies are not. But that is not unconnected with the fact that we are not China's size. So frankly, from our point of view, the important thing is to grow the economy. And as far as technology is concerned, there are stages. There's a stage when you need to catch up with where the production frontier is. And then there's a stage when you need to be pushing it further forward. We are nowhere near the production frontier. So we are mainly in the world of catching up. Yes, if we achieve the objectives of Viksit Bharat 2047, become a developed country, we need to seriously think about putting money into research. Actually, we should do that even now, because some problems are uniquely Indian problems, and the West is not going to solve them. I mean, for example, if you want a cure for malaria or a vaccine against malaria, you can't make money on that very easily. It'll have to be done by us. And I think we need to think, are we putting the money into the kinds of things that will be the technological backbone of future development, or are we just wasting it in freebies of one kind or another? And my guess is at the moment that we are doing more of the latter and not enough of the former.
A follow-up to just what you mentioned at the end is, are you for freebies or are you against the freebie culture?
That's a very, very good question. Fortunately, I'm not standing for election. If I was standing for election, I would, and you said, are you for freebies, are you for loan waivers? I would have to say that, properly managed, there's a role for them. Let me step back. One thing is very clear. The name of the game cannot be growth alone. Nobody would be satisfied with that. We want a process of growth that is inclusive. And inclusive means that it must do something for the poor. It must also provide hope for the non-poor. Because actually, it's not enough to say we're reducing poverty in some mechanical sense. It's important to say that everybody along the spectrum has a chance of a better life. Okay? So that is very important. But whether that is achieved by these freebies or achieved by other things is a very open question. So I'm in favor of the state playing a bigger role in delivering public goods for which it has to spend money. And for example, if those goods involve underpricing of the output, I'm in favor of that. For example, education. I mean, clearly primary education, even secondary education should be free, but it should be of a good quality. I mean, it's no good having free public sector education of poor quality, which pushes people into spending money on private sector education. So there's lots that the state must do, and certainly health is another classic example. It's perhaps the best example where the government should step in and provide people an assurance that should they fall ill, there'll be something to do. But I'm not so convinced that, you should just have all kinds of non-contributory employment benefits. That becomes more like a freebie. Or for that matter, I mean, the cancellation of loans is a very open area. I mean, traditionally we've done it for farmers. The next step will be, why not do it for students? Students are encouraged to take loans to get educated in private institutions. They get burdened by debt. How about cancelling all that debt? Similarly, mudra loans, small loans. I mean, if you start down this road, what will happen is that you'll kill the financial system, basically.
So you talked about challenges like production and research and everything, like we have not reached that mark. So you were part of the economic reforms in 91. The current government had super majority in the past 2 terms they had. So there is a perception that they could not bring about huge economic reforms. So what do you think are challenges for a diverse democracy like India when it comes to for implementing economic reforms?
Yeah, it's actually quite tough. I mean, of course, everything gets polarized. So one way of addressing your question is that we did much better in pushing economic reforms than they're doing now. I think you should recognize that we had an easier job. I mean, the reforms needed then were so obvious,
Yes.
and some of the interventions of the government were so ridiculous that getting rid of all of them was quite, well, it wasn't easy because there were still people who criticized, but it was a no-brainer in a way. And within 2 years, it was quite clear that the country is not collapsing, it's doing quite well, thank you. And so most of these reforms these controls were in effect, useless. Now I think we are in a much, much more difficult phase. The reforms have to be far more carefully thought out, and some of them will address vested interests which are politically very sensitive. Let me, the usual argument is about farm laws. I myself, when I was asked by the Punjab government shortly after the UPA government ended, I was then a free person outside government, and I think the Punjab government asked me to submit a report on what should Punjab do to recover its prime position. And I had a very good team which included many very distinguished agricultural economists, and we all suggested that we need reforms in agricultural marketing, which are not that different from what the present government tried to do. But we were addressing the state government, and of course the state government never listened to us. Okay. This was the big problem. I think you can't solve that problem just by having a national law. And I think part of the problem here was the government rushed through the national law without even a debate. It would have been much better if you had called the farmer organizations and maybe conceded here and there something. I think when you're dealing with complex issues, you need to involve the stakeholders. Very often, just being heard is a source of satisfaction. What they call sunwai. So not being heard irritates people. I think we have, but it's not just a matter of being heard. Take for example, climate change. We want to bring in steps that will help us get to net zero. It's a commendable objective. The single most important thing there is going to have to be to get rid of electricity based on coal and replace it with electricity from solar and wind and other sources. Now we need to take a hard look at what are the policies that would come in the way of achieving this. At the moment, this is still more expensive, okay? Frankly, if renewable electricity, including the storage necessary to give an even supply, if it were cheaper than coal, then it would happen automatically. With storage, it's not cheaper. So the question is, how do you get people to accept that? One solution is you have a carbon tax. That is, nobody wants to accept. The other solution which we are following is you tell the discoms that you must purchase X amount of renewable. But if the renewable is more expensive, then the discoms have to pass that on as a higher price of power. When they do that, you must avoid political intervention, saying, no, you can't pass it on. I think until the public realizes that this needs to be done, it'll be difficult to get it done. So you need much more education of the public that, look, this is really important.
we have more questions for you lined up in the guest lecture that you're about to
Okay.
give us. So for now, it's a wrap for this edition of the Thinking podcast. Thank you very much to our viewers. It was an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on our podcast, sir. This will be one for the grandkids where I'll tell if eventually I marry and I have kids, I'll tell them I interviewed Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia.
My dad would definitely be very happy seeing me interview you, for sure.
Well, I'm delighted that to have the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank
And
you
I
so
hope
much.
the podcast goes down well.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I'm
you
going
so
to see
much.
the podcast to make sure I haven't made a fool of myself.
It was amazing, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Please
thanks a lot.
like, share and subscribe for more content. Thank you.